So, Austin Stack, welcome, first of all.
Thanks, Nicola.
Your book, Justice from My Father, has been published by Bonnier and is available everywhere in shops, etc.
That's correct.
And on audio.
And on audiobook,
We might get an extract from it for our listeners as well. But just before we started this, we were discussing really where to start in this story, because it is a huge story and so many elements of it. And we decided between us that the best place to start is at the beginning. Which is usually what I find when you sit down to write a book. You can come up with all sorts of farty ways of starting it and doing this, that and the other. But actually to take things chronologically is usually the best way. Now, your father, Brian Stack, was shot. He was a prison officer and he was shot by the IRA on the South Circular Road in March of 1983. And you have made it your life to try and basically bring somebody to justice for that. Thus the name of your book, Justice for My Father. So let's go back to your childhood. You were 14 at the time when he was shot. So you do have a life before and after.
Yeah.
And tell us about the family, where you were living, and about your dad.
I suppose the first thing is my dad would have been, he's a local Portlaoise man, and he was born and brought up in Portlaoise. And at the time in Portlaoise, he came from a separated family in the 1930s, which obviously
unusual.
It was very unusual, and I suppose there wasn't that much money in the house, so he ended up, doing some work in some of the factories locally before he went into the prison service, because the prison service was somewhere where you could get a stable job with a pension, and there was a lot of career opportunities. So he went into the prison service in 1959. Now, prior to that, he would have been very much involved in the local boxing club and the local GAA club. And
so 1959, what was Portlaoise like?
So very small town in 1959.
But the prison was...
The prison was the main employer, and probably what was known as the Worsted Mills and Kelly's the Foundry, which built all the hay sheds for farmers around the country. Those were the three, I suppose, main employers in the town.
And who was in the prison back then in 59?
It was local. So at the time, after independence, and you'll still see these prisons dotted around the country, the old county prisons. So there would have been one in Tullamore, there would have been one in Dundalk, there would have been one in Carlow. Every provincial town had a county prison. But the state started closing down all those county prisons after independence. And for some reason, Portlaoise was actually left and hadn't been closed down. So there would have been regular prisoners in it. Just your run-of-the-mill people that were there for petty thefts. Though you would have had people that were in for life sentences as well. But there would have been generally people from the local area or in the immediate area. Would have been those that would have been in Portlaoise at the time.
I love visiting prisons. I love visiting prisons. Anywhere I go in the world, if I can, I love it. I find them so interesting, fascinating.
They're steeped in history.
Oh my God. And sometimes when they're older and the cell doors, you realise how tall we've got, because people were so small. And how did they survive in some of the conditions?
I don't know. I visited, I worked in Limerick Prison in 2006 and 2007, and there was an older part of Limerick Prison that was still active at the time. It's closed now, but the cell doors were weenchy.
Yeah,
I mean, now they were so small. You had to. I'm not a big man, but I had to bend down getting into them.
Yeah.
It's just interesting how we've developed as human beings.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And Mountjoy, the cell doors wouldn't be particularly tall. And that again, but not as small as the ones that I saw in Limerick.
So 59, we would have been looking at. There wouldn't have been a massive probably amount of murders, or there was no drug problem yet.
Yeah.
We're back in a kind of a simpler age, a simpler era. There is poverty and there's hunger, and people are probably committing crimes in order to live, get by. Plus, you've got the baddies.
Yeah.
It
would have been, the state went on a period of shutting down prisons.
Yeah.
And I suppose the last one to shut down would have been St. Patrick's Institution, was in Clonmel, and they moved that to what was the female prison in Mountjoy at the time. And that was because we just didn't have, there was no females in prison at the time, hardly. And they kept one wing of that for the female prisoners. And there was only maybe 400 or 500 prisoners in the whole state at the time. And that was just the way, as you say, it was a simpler time. There was very little crime. And then towards the back end of the 60s, you had the troubles in Northern Ireland, which spilled over down here. And then in the 70s, you had the heroin epidemic. And the correlation is unreal when you actually look at the rise in prison numbers from that period. It's exclusively connected with the
your
heroin
dad was
epidemic.
20 years there and would have seen those decades you're describing and those changes before he was promoted to the chief officer in Portlaoise. And like, do you remember him coming home? Did he tell stories over the dinner table or anything?
No, you see, that's, well, I suppose my dad, he was in Mountjoy for a couple of years, then back to Portlaoise. And when we would have been quite small when he got transferred to Cork, and that was his first promotion in 1973. And he went down to Cork for assistant chief officer. And at that stage, we moved down to Cork. But I can still remember as he was acting chief quite quickly. There was a chief's vacancy down there, and he was acting chief, which was the head of security in the prison. And he brought myself and my brothers into the prison to show us a cell. So I would have been about 5 or 6 at the time. And now that's not everything. That's not something that every young fellow will ever see. But I still have this vivid memory of that prison cell and looking out the window and seeing the prisoners playing football out in the yard. But when he came back to Portlaoise in 1978, Portlaoise was a completely different prison at that stage, okay? So, and it was at this stage our memories would have been, we were starting to get it. So 1978, I would have been 10. He didn't talk about what was going on inside in the prison. Security-wise, you just couldn't. He did warn us always that, you know, never to talk about his job, never to talk about his comings and goings. That was the kind of dinner table talk we would have. If there was stuff going on in the prison or if there was protesters around the town, we'd be told, you know, make sure you don't say anything about where I work or what's going on in the prison. Only 2 occasions I can actually remember him talking about the prison or his work. And one was he came home one dinner time and he was really angry. And it was an IRA prisoner either his mother or father had passed away, but the priest came in, the chaplain, and gave him the wrong information and told him the wrong parent had died.
Oh, nice.
And my father was up to the nines because he was going to have to go back and rectify that problem. And I remember him saying to us, look, no matter what these people have done, no matter what they're in for, and some of them are in for really bad things, they're human beings. And we have to treat them as human beings. And he had to go back and rectify the issue and tell the guy that it was his father was dead instead of his mother, or whichever way around.
Emotions of that, like,
yeah, absolutely. And like the only other time he spoke about the job was I remember him being very, very annoyed around the time that Senator Billy Fox was murdered, and when those prisoners came in, he really had an issue around that because my dad was someone that. He came from quite a Republican background in that his mother's family were related to Sarah Curran, who was Robert Emmett's fiancée. And my grandmother was born in 1889, and they were put off their land down in Tipperary and they were sent west. And she had this real Republican streak in her, and she was very much a De Valera woman, and obviously she indoctrinated that in my dad. But my dad was the type of person that he didn't kind of take indoctrination. He obviously was heavily influenced by her, but we had this huge big long bookcase that spanned either side of the fireplace in our sitting room at home, and it was wall to wall with books about the likes of Emmett, Tone, Joy McCracken, all these old United Irishmen Republicans, but then you had the modern stuff with, as we would have seen, of De Valera and even the likes of Michael Collins and stuff. And my dad, while he would have been a De Valera supporter and in that vein, he also kind of was, you know, very keen to teach us about Collins and that side of Irish history. And remember, we were in Cork, he brought us out to Belnablaw, and he was very much a student of republicanism, but kind of real pure republicanism, that he felt that everybody had a voice and that this was, you know, no matter what part of the country you came from, what your religion was, what the colour of your skin was, what your class was, you had the same voice as the next person. And that's how democracy was built. And I think the Senator Billy Fox murder really got to him in that he saw it was an attack on this state, an attack on democracy, and also a sectarian attack.
So in the north, like I presume we're talking around that same time, the prison officers were different up there. The prison officers were hated.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
What was it like down here? Or did you get a sense of it? Or have you had to look back and delve into history to find
no, I didn't.
Were they the enemy? Or
no, I didn't get that sense. Now, I have spoken to a lot of ex-prisoners, okay? Now, I spoke to one or two ex-IRA prisoners, but I spoke to an awful lot of ordinary prisoners that would have worked. Ordinary prisoners were brought to Portlaoise at the time to do the menial tasks and the working, and they got 50% remission. And a lot of them that I would have worked with in my time in the prison would have spoke very highly of my dad and that. But I never got the sense that the prison officers were the enemy, if you like. But I think, you know, we reached a point in I suppose in the history of the Troubles and that where there was a kind of an agreement, I suppose, reached with the IRA prisoners in that they wouldn't try and escape if they got certain you know, things like release for family funerals and weddings and stuff like that. And there was an onus on them to make sure their people came back and stuff like that. But I do know when skipping forward, when we went to meet with the IRA, the context they said that they put the shooting my dad into was around the prison struggles. And when I asked the guy, the IRA leader we met, like, I mean, you know, when he phrased it like that, I said, what were your prison struggles in relation to it? And he said to me, oh, well, our families were put behind screens for screen visits and there was strip searches of our prisoners. And I said to him, back in 2013, I said, there's actually, I said, still 2 prisons in this country that have only screen visits. At the time, Clover Hill and St. Patrick's. So I said, that's not something that's unique to IRA prisons.
And compared to the north, where you hear stories of people being scalded with boiling water, and I mean, there was horrific things went on in the prison, and the IRA did see the prison officers as a target and a legitimate. They saw them as a legitimate target, but it does feel as if things were just totally different down here.
Totally different. There wasn't that sort of atmosphere at all down here.
So did you sense, coming up to March 1983, when your father is shot in Dublin after an amateur boxing tournament at the National Stadium, did you sense fear, or his fear, or was he aware that he had become a target? No, I don't think he was aware of that. And if he was, he didn't really show it because he was very much involved in the community. And, you know, the boxing club was the big thing at that time. He had been a GA referee prior to that, but he was going up and down to Dublin on a regular basis, refereeing and judging fights and bringing us around the country and to boxing tournaments. And I do know that subsequently we have become aware that he was followed on 2 of those occasions when he went to Dublin. But his awareness, was, you know, he was bringing you and was being seen publicly with you guys. And you can imagine if somebody knows they're under threat or any sort of imminent threat, they certainly won't be going out with their kids. He certainly didn't. Nothing changed. No. And I even there was one occasion when he was driving up to Dublin and he had another boxing coach, just the 2 of them in the car, and the other coach saw a motorbike following them and said it to him, and he said, oh no, don't be worried about that, that's nothing, that's, you know. Paranoid. Yeah. You're being paranoid type of thing. And it was the same after my brother Oliver won the Leinster Boxing Championships. They went back somewhere to eat and there was a guy following him on a motorbike and he actually came off the bike and one of the other coaches saw it and my dad just said, look, strange things happen in Dublin, you know, and that was just the way he wrote it off. And I don't think he was in any way kind of suspected that there was something about to happen. So when you weren't in Dublin, you were at home, were you? Yeah, because that particular night, his friend was driving and there was 4 or 5 men and Joe Ging was the driver and he brought his own son with him. So there just wasn't enough room in the car for any of us to go that night. And we kind of had a bit of a row with him about that night, because everybody wants to go to the national finals, you know, and as kids we had gone before, so
it was just like one of those nights that we couldn't go. And I suppose we were probably blessed that we didn't go that night.
And was he on foot or was he in the car when he was shot?
No, he was coming across the road.
Yeah.
So basically when he came out of the stadium that night, the rest of them had gone back to the car, and he had gone to congratulate Noel Gyrey, who won the heavyweight title that night. And my dad had kind of supported Noel's cause and getting his first Irish cap and stuff. And he went back to the dressing room to congratulate him. And then as he was going back to the car, which was on Washington Street, just directly opposite the North Circular Road on the National Stadium on the South Circular Road, as he crossed the street, there was a guy waiting to identify him to the gunman, and he nodded at my dad to the gunman, and then the gunman came up behind him and at the top of Washington Street and shot him in the back of the head. And then this motorbike came, and the guy got on the back of the bike, and away they went.
Okay. So did they believe they had left your father for dead?
Yeah. And that was one of the questions that, you know, when we met again with the IRA and jumping forward, they had asked us for a list of questions. And one of the questions that my mother was very eager to ask was, did they actually intend to kill him that night, or was it a warning? And the answer we got quite firmly was no, the intention was to kill him.
The intention was to kill him.
Yeah.
So he doesn't die, of course. He lives for 18 months after that, but maybe just stick to that night. And do you remember how you heard? Or
yeah, I was. I just knew there was something not right that night. I couldn't go to sleep, and
before your father was killed.
Yeah, I knew there was. I just knew there was something not. Just this kind of sixth sense, something was wrong. My bedroom was at the front of the house, and sometime kind of around midnight, I could see car headlights coming down the driveway, and I got up out of my bed and I went down to the kitchen, and the first thing I saw was this kind of, I thought was initially was a strange man. It was my uncle. I didn't recognize him in a trench coat in the corner on the phone, and I then looked and I saw my granny, and she was there with my mother, and my granny said to me, "Look, your dad has been in an accident. He was hit by a motorbike. Just go back to bed, Austin." And you kind of, I suppose, when the adults in your life are telling you these things, you go back to bed. And then it kind of dawned on me, this is not adding up. And I decided I'd try the radio and see. And at that stage, of course, the radio was all shut down at midnight and there was nothing happening. So I sat up all night waiting for the first radio broadcast to come on the following morning at 6 or 7 o'clock, whenever it was. And I heard it then on the radio. And at that stage, then I went down to my 2 younger brothers, and I brought them into the bed and I told them what was after happening. And they didn't believe me. So we put on the radio again, and I came across on the radio again. And at that stage, my granny came into the room. She had stayed the night when my mother went to Dublin, and she was kind of, I was hoping you wouldn't hear it on the radio, you know. And because at that stage, every kid had a radio. A lot of these Ghetto Blasters at the time. And so that's how we heard.
And like, what dots were being joined at that stage? Was the news bulletin, a prison officer has been shot by suspected paramilitaries? Was a man has been shot on a Dublin street? Or what was, do you remember the...
Oh no, the words were Chief Prison Officer Brian Stack. Oh, they named him, and they said he was I can still remember they said he was in a critical condition.
So they were linking the whole thing to his job and his position.
Yeah. And like to this day, you know, when I hear now that somebody is critically injured in a shooting, it straight away goes into my head, this is pretty bad.
Exactly, yeah.
Because I just relate it back to the condition my dad was in, you know.
So you've gathered with your brothers and you're speaking to them and you're trying to... Your mother has gone to the hospital?
She's gone to the hospital. She went to the hospital that night with my uncle.
Yeah.
So it was just my granny who was there. And of course, my granny being a bit of a soldier, and she put us on to the car and brought us down to Mass, which was the last place we wanted to go to.
That was the answer to everything there.
That was the answer to everything in those days, yeah. And we went down to Mass, and it was the last place, and everybody was looking at us, and people are whispering and to one another and nodding over at us, and you know, it was just we just didn't want to be there.
And you were like, do you have a sense from early on that you're the oldest now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think in my own sense, I went into that kind of overdrive role just with adrenaline, like, I mean, having to go down and tell the boys, that my 2 brothers and stuff like that. I mean, that was just pure adrenaline. I didn't even think about that. I just did it. And I do know when we went back out to school and that, and into September, Oliver came out to the boarding school that we were in. It was a Monday to Friday boarding school. We came home to weekends, but Oliver did not want to be there at all. And I kind of had to be he was getting bullied, and I had to be quite protective of him. So there was a lot of that went on at the time where I was kind of, you know, in that role of the elder brother.
They say that, you know, traumatized people can identify the exact moment their childhood ends.
You know, I don't know if that's I don't know if that kind of is.
But everything must have changed.
Yeah, well, no, everything changed, but I don't know if my childhood ended. I suppose I dealt with it. There was no counselling at the time, obviously, 1980s Ireland. The way I dealt with things was I didn't like the intrusion on my life and people looking at you and people coming up to you on the street that you didn't know and asking how your dad was, and, you know, the teachers treating you a little bit differently. So I decided just to act a maggot in school. I acted a complete idiot in school. That was my way of dealing with it. I kind of created an alternative Austin, if you like, just someone that was different. I didn't want to be seen as the young fellow whose dad was shot. And that's how I kind of dealt with it at the time. And that, I suppose, led me to not doing a great leaving cert, not getting into a good course, and then just going through a myriad of different jobs and down till I landed in the prison. Like, and that's just how my life went. But it was a direct result of what happened. But I don't know if I kind of got to the point where I was going to my childhood ended, but I did. It kind of was more kind of the, shall we say, take a leadership role with my brothers and stuff like that. Yeah.
So in the kind of months going forward, come back to the Garda investigation, the 18 months when he survived, he was at home sometimes. And like, do you remember going to see him the first time? And
so basically what happened, that 18 months could be broken up into 3 tranches, if you like. The first 6 months he was in a coma.
Right.
And then the next 6 months, he was out of the coma but in the National Rehab Centre. And then the last 6 months he was at home. So the first time we went to see him, it was shortly before he came out of the coma. He was still in a coma. So it was like 4 or 5 months later. And they kind of tried to distract us a bit in that Laois were playing loud in the Leinster Football Championship. So my uncle brought us up to the football. And then we went out to the rehab centre in Dundee after the match. And we were brought into the ICU room where he was. And this nurse was there. And the first thing that I remember very vividly, his eyes were open. And that took us all by shock.
Were open or opened?
Opened.
Okay. Yeah, that would have shocked me. Yeah.
And we weren't expecting this. And the nurse straight away copped on that, the eyes, this is a problem. And she said, no, he's eyes, he's in a coma, he is in a coma, he hasn't woken up, but his eyes are open. And she said to us, look, have you got the programme for the match? And I said, yeah. And she said to me, look, just hold the programme over his eyes, go through the team with him one by one, line by line. And it was really, really funny. He was showing no reaction. And I got to this guy that played centre field for Laois at the time, and he was quite a famous Laois footballer who had worked in the prison service. His name was John Costello, and he's known affectionately still in Laois as Big John. And John left the prison service to go find fame and fortune in New York. And he had gone to America when my dad was shot. So when I pointed to his name on the thing and said, on midfield, John Costello, my dad the eyes kind of just give a flicker, and it was kind of like this astonishment, this expression of astonishment. And the nurse copped it as well, and she said, "Oh, keep going, he might recognise somebody else." And we read down to the rest of the names with no recognition of anybody else. But I suppose what he was doing was he was saying to himself, "I thought he was in America." So then about a month later, he came out of the coma. And they did some intense work with him because he was paralysed from the neck down, and he was very badly brain damaged. It was probably like having a 2-year-old child in the house. He got very moody. Like when he did come home, we had to get the house adapted. We had to get a special car, we had to get an extension of the house, all that sort of stuff. And it was quite difficult when he was at home. A lot of people were coming to see him at that stage as well. But he could get very grumpy with the people that come to see him. But after they came once or twice, they began to realise that this was the way he was. And he could remember things from when he was a child. But if you were reading a newspaper to him and reading an article in the paper, he wouldn't remember when you'd move on to the next article what the article you were just after reading was. His short-term memory it just wasn't there.
It must be really difficult to see your father like that.
Yeah, it was very, very difficult. Like, I mean,
did you have hope that he was going to get a bit better, or
no? We knew he wasn't going to get any better
wasn't.
than that. No, we knew we were well aware of that he wasn't going to get any better than what he was. And
was there any speech?
There was speech, but it was very. Again, it was very childlike. There was, but it was childlike, and it was. He would talk to you, but again, like if he was talking to you, he'd forget what he said 2 minutes, and I'd keep asking the same questions over and over again because his memory just wasn't there. And I told you that a minute ago, Dad, or whatever, And
did you think that he realised, or did you have to tell him that he was your dad?
Oh no, he
knew who he was.
Yeah. Oh yeah. He did. Like when that first day we came into the hospital after he woke up, like he recognised us coming down the corridor.
That must have felt like a miracle.
Yeah. Like so he did know, he did recognise us and stuff.
Yeah.
Like that there was no issue with that, and people that came to see him, say from the prison or from the boxing or the GA worlds or politics, he recognised them all.
He did.
Yeah.
And did he have any idea what had happened to him?
He didn't. He had no memory of that night at all.
And did anyone ever decide to speak to him about it? Or?
Oh yeah, they did. Like, I mean, the guards interviewed him, and he was made well aware of what had actually happened. That was, he was made really aware of that, and he had been interviewed a good few times to see had his memory improved of maybe stuff that was going on in the prison and things like that would have led to him being shot.
So how did he went downhill? Obviously, did he get infections or something like that?
What happened was most of his internal organs were pretty bad. His kidneys had shut down a few times, and
because of the coma,
because of the from the night of the shooting itself. But he essentially his organs just gave up, and it was what the official death cert is bronchial pneumonia due to his injuries. That's the official death cert, due to the injuries from the shooting.
Yeah. And did you feel that you got him back for a little while, or did it feel like him?
It didn't feel like him. No, he probably would have been better off maybe to have passed away that night.
Yeah.
Because realistically, we didn't have the same man back with us at all.
Did everyone feel that? Your mum?
My mum would feel probably the same way too, and to be honest with you, she was 39 at the time, and that was a big ordeal for her, and she was raising three teenage boys, and then she had this man who was in this particular condition, and the hospital saying you have to take him home now. So you can imagine that was quite traumatic for her.
Absolutely. All the while there's a guard investigation obviously going on initially into the injuries your father had suffered, but obviously after his death, it was a murder inquiry.
Yep.
So what's happening with that, or are you aware of that at the time?
So we weren't aware of that at the time. Initially, the reports in the media were that the IRA, INLA and the Prisoners' Revenge Group had all issued statements denying they had anything to do with the murder. And the media were speculating that it was probably some splinter group from the IRA, somebody with a grudge. That was the talk in the media at the time. And I suppose we had no knowledge of what was going on inside the prison at the time. We'd no knowledge of the things that were happening. And it was only years later, I'm talking now, up to 1996, a guy that used to work with my dad came to me when I was working in Mountjoy, and I knew this guy from when he worked in Portlaoise, and he said to me, he called me aside and he said, "Look, do you know what was going on down in Portlaoise at the time?" He says, "Do you know why your dad was shot and what was going on?" And I said, "I have a clue." The only communication my family had with the guards in the intervening period was when I went to join the prison, when I had done my medical. My mother wrote to the guards in December 1990 and for an update. And basically she got a one-line answer back saying that the case was still open and that if there was any developments, she'd be brought into the loop. And that was it. We had heard nothing. And this guy explained to me what was going on, that my dad had been working on something, that he knew there was a gun in the prison, that he knew the IRA were trying to escape, that he had a mole within the IRA who was telling him when they had a key to a particular gate that they needed to get through to get out to the main gate, and that my dad would change the lock on that gate once a month because he had to be on top of it. The only thing we knew was that my dad would not come on 2 weeks holidays with us. He only ever come on 1 week. He'd come the second week because he couldn't trust to leave the prison on its own for 2 weeks. We were told, I was told by this man, that basically that's why that you didn't know who your friend was in the prison at the time. A couple of weeks later, my brother Oliver was approached by another prison officer who worked in Portage at the time and was given pretty much the same information. But what we had, this is 1996, we had two guys giving us basically what was hearsay. And we'd no way of connecting that, or we'd know, there was no real evidence of it. And it wasn't until Barry Cummins wrote his book Unsolved, and Barry approached us and asked, could he write a chapter on my dad? And he said, look, the benefits are for you guys, we might be able to uncover something. And it was during that, his research for that book, that he got to see the Garda file, and he came back to us and he said to us, are you aware that there's a lot of material evidence? And we kind of said, no, like there was a helmet found, the bike was dumped in the canal, and there was a Never Every factory beside that canal, beside where the bike was, and there was the helmet from the bike was dumped up on top of that, and the guards got that helmet. There was also fingerprint evidence off of a newspaper that the spotter was using. There was the guy that was driving the bike had put his hands on a car, and there was a lot of different fingerprints evidence. There was also a car came to take the team that had done the shooting out of Dublin after they dumped the bike. And they had ran a red light over on Dartmouth Square, and there was a patrol car in the area and saw them run the red light. And the guys thought they were being chased for the shooting rather than the red light, and they ditched the car and ran. And there was a lot of fingerprints taken out of that car. So there was all this evidence, and there was also a really good eyewitness who had seen the motorbike driver without his helmet. So prior to the shooting,
given a name?
What?
Were you given a name of a suspect?
No. So at that time we weren't. There was Barry just gave us what was on the stuff that was on the file, and we were able to go back to the guards and challenge them and say, "Look, you have all this," and they had to admit that they did. But it appeared that the file had just been shut after about a month. That was what it appeared had happened. So I mean, we were very suspicious as to why that should happen, particularly when they had all this evidence. And we looked for the cold case unit, serious crime review team were just after being set up at the time.
So we're up to 2007 then.
Yeah.
This stage.
Yeah. So we asked them to take on the case.
14 years after your.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So to be, it was nice. So you're talking 1983 up to 2007.
24, is it? I missed out 10 years.
Yeah. So they took on the case.
100% of my mathematics is incorrect. not even like 100%.
100%.
The minute I said it, I went, no, that's right.
No. Yeah, so when they done their review, they found 198 things that should have been done in the first investigation that weren't. Simple things like the crime scene wasn't mapped. Now, they did give us the name of 5 people that had been arrested around the time, and one of those is quite significant in that he became an individual who I was subsequently then a number of years later told by a journalist who had gotten the information from 2 IRA men that this was one of the individuals that was there on the night. So like that cold case review, it kind of went around in circles and it didn't achieve a whole lot, but it went back to NBCI, who then the commissioner then asked the NBCI to carry out the current investigation. And that's ongoing since about 2009.
Okay. Now, the big point in all this was in 2013, you met with Gerry Adams and you were brought to meet him out the country somewhere, is that?
So, yeah, well, what happened was the guards came to me in January 2012 and they told me that it was their belief the IRA hadn't done this.
Hadn't,
yes. And they were quite emphatic about it. And this inspector told me he looked in their eye and he believed them when they told him that they hadn't done it. So I knew at that stage that they were the only ones with the ability to take on. This was an attack on the state. You know, they had the motivation because they were trying to have an escape attempt for Portlaoise. My dad was blocking that escape attempt. So they had the ability, they had the motivation. So it was a case of how do I get them to admit it? So I basically got to Gerry Adams through the Sinn Féin TD Brian Stanley. I challenged him on local radio and in Portlaoise about statements he had made during the 2011 presidential campaign. And Adams agreed to meet me on the back of that. And myself and my brother Oliver went to meet him in the Dáil. And the first thing he did was he tried to kind of intimidate us he threw the arm across the back of the chair in a real nonchalant sort of a way like that. And, oh, you're very brave men to come in here and see me. And that was his opening line, like. Yeah. And I kind of looked at him and just said, nothing brave about coming to see TD in Dáil Éireann like that. At that stage, I think he realised that he wasn't going to be able to kind of get to me that easily. Yeah. And then he started the whole, well, I'm a victim too business. And at that stage, I had said to my brother Oliver, he's going to play that card at some stage. And I said, just let me deal with that. So I banged the table and I pointed the finger at him. You're not the victim here, I'm the victim. My mother was sitting across the hotel across the way is the victim. And, you know, a victim is someone that has to go down and scratch his father's nose at 3 o'clock in the morning when he's screaming because he can't do it himself. I said, that's what a victim is. You know, I kind of went really heavy on him. And then I just sat back in the chair and I went, now, Deputy, I said, I'm here asking you for your help to see if you can get people in your organisation and talk to people in your organisation to find out some answers for me. And with that, the whole mood of the thing changed. And he kind of went outside with Richard McCauley, his assistant, and they came back and they said they could help us or that there would be a process. And that process over 3 or 4 meetings led to us going in a blacked out van in July 2013. Up the last leg of the journey was in the blacked out van, up the Cooley Mountains into South Armagh we went, and to meet with a man who described himself as having a senior leadership role in the IRA at the time of the ceasefire.
And what did he tell you?
So basically, he had a statement prepared. We had been asked to give a list of questions, which we did, on the proviso that we could ask some follow-on questions. So the statement basically addressed most of the questions we had asked. So basically, they said in the statement they wish to acknowledge that the IRA had carried out the attack on my dad, and they wish to acknowledge that it had taken so long for them to acknowledge that. But then, of course, they went off kilter and they said it was carried out by a person with a leadership role who got his volunteers and his unit to carry out the attack, but it hadn't been sanctioned by the Army Council. And
kind of removing one step of room.
They were trying to admit to it, but remove themselves from it. Now, I challenged him on that at the time, and Adams then said to me, well, it was 3 years before we know who actually, that it was our people did it and we disciplined them, is what he said. Now, I knew who had sanctioned it, and I knew why they couldn't admit to that at the time. And I subsequently spoke with Sean O'Callaghan, who was the informer and wrote the book. And I went to meet him when he was in the witness protection program in the UK. I tracked him down and I went to meet him. And I spent a whole day with him. And he told me that he was in a house just outside Portlaoise couple of weeks beforehand when the operation was being planned. He told a similar story to the Gardaí. It married in that the people that were in the house were the people that I had become aware at this stage through several different sources, were the people that had organised the attack and had sanctioned it. And 2 of those individuals were Sinn Féin public representatives back in 2013. So that's why they kind of put themselves that one step removed from it.
And also the motivation, was it that story about the escape plan and your father thwarting it?
So what was happening was, if you remember, in 1983 it was a particularly violent year in terms of the Troubles. You had my dad was shot, you had Shergar was robbed, you had Don Tidy was kidnapped, and then obviously in the hunt for him, Paddy Kelly and Gary Sheehan were murdered. You also had the shootout at the Gale and Weston
It was all down here.
Huh?
And that was all down here.
And that's what I'm saying to you, that was all down here.
Was 83 the shooting at the graveyard, Michael Stone in the north?
Oh, I think that was slightly after that. Yeah, I think that was it was after Gibraltar. I think that was slightly after that.
Maybe it was 85.
But what they were trying to do was have a double escape, one from the Maze and one from Portlaoise in 1983, to have a big PR coup. And they had their escape from the Maze, I think it was around September time, 83. And the problem they had in Portlaoise was that my dad had just kept changing the lock on that last gate they needed to get through. And when I was actually researching the book, I came across an article that one of the escapees, those that attempted to carry out that escape, they basically they couldn't carry out that escape after my dad was shot because they didn't know what his mental faculties were. And they waited until he passed away before they actually attempted that escape. So that was done in, I think it was February 85, they attempted that escape. And again, in an article written from Public, their newspaper, they highlight how they had these keys for particular gates to get as far as the main gate. So it was backing up their actual own story about the escape attempt backed up what I had actually previously been told, and how my dad had been kept changing these locks, and that's basically why they took him out, because they needed to have this escape.
Michael Stone was 1988, just before I get a slew of people telling me that I had it wrong. But do you think they tried to speak to him or warn him or, corrupt him?
No, not that I'm aware of. And that has never been, in all the contacts I've had with ex-IRA people, journalists, Gardaí, who have, nobody has ever come to me with any story of that.
He would have shown their hand, of course, by doing that.
Yeah, they probably would have been. Yeah, he would put them on guard. But I've never heard that now from anyone. So
after 2013, you were able to kind of go back and say to the Gardaí, look, this is what I have. You have names at that stage, suspects you believe. Since then, because we're another 12 years on from then, what has happened and why has there been no prosecutions in this case?
So essentially, the Gardaí initially, I got them the name of the shooter, okay, and the name of the guy that organised it and drove the bike. But his name had previously been given to us by the guards back in 2007, and I was able to say to them, well, look, these two guys were acting in the same unit. They were both involved in the Gale and Weston shootout as well. And I said that happened 3 months after my dad was shot. So these were obviously all acting in cohort as a team. And eventually the guards got agreed to that was something that did happen. They were pursuing the bottom line was they had to get somebody to talk. Because they kept telling us that this evidence was lost, that the evidence I spoke about was lost. Don't know where it is. And the fingerprint archive was washed out in a flood. And so we had all this stuff was missing, and we kept probing them on different things. And, it would go through periods where I would hear nothing, and then somebody would come to me with another piece of information. I remember a very retired, very senior guard that worked in counterterrorism came to me with information after I met him at a function, and I was able to bring that back to the loop to the Gardaí. We had instances like an individual who was out in Spain who was OC at the Dublin Brigade at the time, and he's also wanted in relation to Jerry McCabe's murder. And the guards went out to speak to him in Spain, and he was wanted for another serious matter here in Dublin, and he was eventually extradited on that matter from Spain. But he was given bail in the High Court, and he scarpered. And I just said to the guards at that stage, I said, are you guys for real? This guy is wanted for 2 capital murders as well as that other serious crime, and you stood by and let him get bail, and it just doesn't. And
Did they not objected to the bail, or
and like they said to me, I remember it was
it?
Assistant Commissioner John O'Driscoll said to me, well, Austin, he says, we objected to the bail. And I said to him, but how strongly did you object? I said, if you had to put it to the court that this man was wanted for more quite senior matters, I don't think he would have got bail. My inkling is that individual was a high-level informant. That's the only thing I can think of. There was another case of another individual who gave information to the Gardaí around 1990s, and he was highly placed within the IRA. And that information was placed on a file, but it was in crime and security. And of course, the investigation team weren't privy to that information until I found out about it. And when I went back to the team, they were as astonished as I was that information was there. And again,
it's not been shared within the guards.
Yeah, they didn't share. That sort of stuff was going on. And John O'Driscoll came back to us, and he actually apologised to us for that at that time, that they found it.
And I do have to say about him, because he's passed away, but he was always a very good, honest,
we only met him a couple of times now.
Yeah.
We had a lot of dealings with Assistant Commissioner Derek Byrne, who we always felt was another guy that was a good guy, and he's out in the Cayman Islands now, I think. But like, I will say we did have our ups and downs with the Gardaí, but the last team that were investigating it were solid guys. And I really believe they wanted to get to the bottom of it.
And did they never feel that they had a circumstantial case?
They did send a file to the DPP about 2 years ago. And that was the time Drew Harris made a public apology to us, and he also sent us a letter apologising for the inadequacies in the 3 separate Garda investigations. And that file came back before Christmas last year. And basically the DPP was looking for more information. And that was in relation to one of the individuals. Now, I subsequently found out where that individual is. He's hiding out in the USA. I don't want to go any further than that, but I have found out quite, a lot about his family circumstances in the USA and where he is in the USA.
It must be very frustrating.
Yeah, and like the gunman is living quite openly up in the northeast of the country, and it is frustrating that unless they come up with the evidence or somebody points the finger, I don't think it's ever going to be a case that's going to be closed. But I did say to Gerry Adams, my initial thing when I met with Adams was, I was in no way, shape or form did I believe that Adams was going to basically give 2 guys to me and say to you, off down to the Garda station with them now. And I kind of asked him, look, can we meet these people? Can we talk to them? And kind of try and come to an understanding as to why you did this, and we could tell them the effects it had on us, and restorative approach.
That kind of restorative justice style thing.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do.
And do you still want that?
Yeah, I would still do that. And tomorrow morning I'd still do that.
And would that be enough?
At this stage, yeah. Because I tell you, Nicola, somebody going to jail, that's not going to bring my dad back. At this stage, we're 40 years down the line. And under the Good Friday Agreement anyway, they're not going to do, I think it's 9 months or something like that. It's not anything significant. So for me, yeah, getting a conviction registered against someone, that would be important maybe. But what would be more important to me is to sit down with that person and to kind of debrief with them and I say to them, why did you do this? What was going through your head?
Or do you want to tell them
how it
impacted you?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole idea of a restorative justice meeting. I suppose I would like it to be, because I'm a restorative justice practitioner myself and I facilitated a lot of meetings, and maybe me going through that with Gerry Adams myself, it probably should have been done by a proper facilitator maybe or something like that. But I would still do that in the morning because it's a way of getting answers and getting closure.
And do you not tell, you're telling it in the book?
Yeah.
But you want to look into someone's eye and tell them?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I do say this in the book, that I explain this in the book about my theory about giving them back their monkey, as I call it. I went through a long period of time where I would have been quite bitter, and I wouldn't have been sleeping at night and weighed down brick and boat shoulders, and And I remember that I wrote an article in 2011 about Martin McGuinness when he was running for president, and it had gone through 3 or 4 drafts where I tried to make it a little less bitter every time I redrafted it. And I gave it to the Independent and I published it. And a friend of mine rang me and she said to me, "Oh my God, that's very bitter. You need to learn how to forgive." And I said to her, "How would you get away out of that?" I said, "Oh, religious stuff." I said, "I'm into that." And she said to me, no, just think about what I'm saying. It'll do you the world of good." And I was going home that evening and I was passing this soccer ground. I was like, something bolt hit me out of the blue. And I kind of got to the idea that if I can forgive them for me, not for them, okay? So I can take the monkey off my back, hand it back to them, say, "You did this, it's your responsibility. Now you take that monkey and you wear it. I'm forgiving you. Well, you just go and do what you like with it now." And it means that I can now challenge them and I can talk about them without being bitter, without weighing down, without me not going to sleep at night time. And I'm in a much better place because I can do that. And that's just how I've dealt with it myself.
And do you still grieve? You're still grieving?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, there are times when I'd love to have my dad. When my kids were born, when say I would have graduated from college, or, different milestones in your life. And, even just simple things, say like, I'll always remember when I went to the Olympics in London to see Katie Taylor win the gold in the boxing. And I remember standing in the stadium that day and just saying, "Oh my God, my dad would love to be here with me." And it's those sort of moments. And again, same thing when I was in Paris watching Kelly Harrington win the gold. I just, those are the things my dad would have loved.
He's always missing.
Yeah, and like, that's where I know he would have, if he was at home, he would have lit up a big cigar and smoked the cigar as he was watching the fight, And that's the sort of, you miss doing that. Or when I remember myself, my brother went down to Mill Street when Steve Collins fought Eubank, and oh my God, my dad would love to be in the car going down there with us that night. Those are the things that you...
So much of life.
So much of life that you,
from all of you, really.
Yeah.
And in particular, and is your mum still alive?
Yeah, she is, yes. No, she's 80 years of age now, and right. She's hale and hearty. Like, she's obviously getting on being 80, but she's still a woman she's a very private woman. And she's a woman that was basically put in a position that she didn't ask for when she was 39 years of age. And it has affected her life ever since. And for me, like, I mean, I'll always remember, and I know Bertie Ahern has in recent times talked about how he feels that the one thing that got wrong in the Good Friday Agreement was not maybe engaging with the victims a bit more. And I'll always remember the day that they did all the prisoner releases from the maze, and the cars, the whooping and cheering and flag waving and partying, and I was watching that on the TV and I went, "Oh my God, my mother." And I got into the car and I drove down to Portlaoise. I was living in Kildare at the time, and down to the house, and there was my mother sitting in the TV room and she was bawling her eyes out. And like, that sort of thing, there was no thought process put into that.
No, I shouldn't have been allowed.
She let them out ones and twos. Yes, we all realised that the prisoners had to get out. That was a given in any peace process. But
the deal should have been that it was done
in a respectful manner.
Right way.
Yeah, in a respectful manner.
Yeah.
So like those things, there are times where my mother just, she can't deal with it, I suppose. And I would always say...
How did she feel about you writing the book?
She wasn't 100% behind it because, again, she's a woman that's very private, and she's very much, for her, it was going to open wounds again, and she knew I would have to talk about stuff maybe that, you wouldn't normally talk about kind of our private lives and stuff like that. But she's got her head around it now. Like, I think secretly she's kind of proud that the book got published and that, and I did dedicate the book to her and the other widows, the likes of, Anne McCabe and people like that, the widows from the Guards and the Army and down here, that were the ones that were never really considered, and they were the ones that were expected to keep quiet for the greater good during the peace process. And I believe the country owes those women, they were women that raised their families and watched the prisoners get out and had to soak up the whole Good Friday Agreement thing. And they were never, I suppose given that recognition, which I think they should have been.
For sure.
Yeah.
Justice for My Father by Austin Stack. Thank you very much for coming in and telling us.
Thanks, Nicola. Cheers.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.